Few alleged practices from history capture the imagination quite like the Viking blood eagle. According to medieval accounts, this execution method involved cutting open a victim's back, breaking their ribs away from the spine, and pulling out their lungs to create a grotesque pair of wings. The victim would supposedly remain alive throughout this ordeal, suffering unimaginable agony before finally dying. It's a description so brutal, so viscerally horrifying, that it has become one of the most infamous elements of Viking culture in popular consciousness. The eagle has featured prominently in modern entertainment, from the television series Vikings to video games and heavy metal album covers. It has become shorthand for Viking savagery, proof that the Norse raiders were capable of unthinkable cruelty. But here's the uncomfortable question that historians have been asking for decades. Did the blood eagle actually exist? Or is it a misunderstood piece of medieval poetry that has been taken literally for centuries? This is the story of the blood eagle, what the sources actually say, what modern forensic science tells us about its feasibility, and what this gruesome legend reveals about how we understand and mythologize the Viking Age. The blood eagle appears in exactly 9 medieval Norse texts, written between the 9th and 13th centuries. What's immediately striking about these accounts is that none of them are eyewitness descriptions. Every single reference comes from skaldic poetry, highly stylized, metaphorical verse composed by court poets, or from sagas written down centuries after the events they purport to describe. The earliest potential reference appears in poetry about the death of King Ella of Northumbria, who was supposedly executed by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok around 865 CE in revenge for their father's death. The skaldic verse describing this event is maddeningly ambiguous. In Old Norse, it says that Ivar, one of Ragnar's sons, had an eagle cut on Ella's back. The phrase used is, "let carve an eagle," or "had an eagle cut." Here's where interpretation becomes crucial. Does this mean an actual anatomical procedure was performed, or is it poetic metaphor? Old Norse poetry was notoriously complex, filled with kennings, compound metaphors that expressed one thing by comparing it to another. Eagles were associated with battlefields in Norse poetry, because they fed on the corpses of the slain. To give someone to the eagle, or feed the eagle, was a common poetic way of saying, kill someone in battle. The other references to the blood eagle follow similar patterns. The death of King Edmund of East Anglia in 869 CE is described in terms that might suggest a blood eagle, though again, the language is ambiguous. The execution of Halfdan, son of King Haraldr of Norway, in the early 9th century is described more explicitly in the Orkney saga, written around 1230 CE, some 400 years after the supposed event. The most detailed description appears in the Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson's 13th century compilation of Norse kings' sagas. Snorri describes Earl Einar of Orkney executing Halfdan by cutting an eagle on his back, and specifically mentions ribs being severed from the spine and lungs being pulled out. But Snorri was writing 3 to 4 centuries after the alleged events, drawing on oral traditions and earlier poetry that may have already been misunderstood. This temporal distance is critical. Imagine someone in 2025 writing a factual account of an execution method supposedly used in the 1600s, based entirely on poetry and oral stories passed down through generations. How reliable would that account be? The blood eagle references we have are exactly this kind of source, late medieval authors interpreting cryptic poetry about events centuries in their past. When we look closely at what the saga accounts actually say, the descriptions are surprisingly inconsistent and brief. They don't provide the kind of detailed, step-by-step procedure you'd expect if this were a well-known execution method. Instead, we get fragments and allusions that medieval audiences might have understood differently than we do. The Orkney saga account of Halfdan's death is perhaps the most explicit. It states that Earl Einar had an eagle cut on his back with a sword and had all the ribs severed from the backbone and then the lungs pulled out. This sounds like a clear description of the procedure as we imagine it. But even here questions arise. Was this meant literally or metaphorically? Was Snorri, writing centuries later, interpreting earlier poetic language as literal fact? Other references are even more ambiguous. Some simply say an eagle was carved on someone's back without further elaboration. In Norse poetry, carving or cutting could refer to sword wounds in general. The phrase might have originally meant something like, he killed him with sword cuts to the back, a statement about the method of killing, not a specific ritual procedure. Medieval Icelandic scholars who compiled these sagas were Christians writing about their pagan ancestors. They had various motivations that might have influenced how they presented Viking Age practices. Some may have wanted to emphasize the savagery of pre-Christian times to highlight how far their society had come. Others might have been elaborating on poetic fragments to create more dramatic narratives. Still others might have genuinely believed they were recording historical facts, unaware they were misinterpreting metaphorical language. The lack of archaeological evidence is also telling. Despite centuries of Viking Age excavations across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and other areas of Norse settlement, no skeleton has been found showing injuries consistent with a blood eagle execution. We have plenty of remains showing battle wounds, executions by beheading, and other forms of violent death, but nothing that looks like someone had their ribs broken away from their spine and lungs removed while still alive. Modern medical experts and forensic scientists have examined whether the blood eagle, as described, would even be physically possible. Their conclusions are sobering and suggest that if the procedure were attempted, it would look very different from popular imagination. First, the basic anatomy. The human ribcage consists of 12 pairs of ribs attached to the thoracic vertebrae of the spine. The ribs curve around to protect the heart and lungs, with the front ends attaching to the sternum, breastbone, via cartilage. To create the wings described in blood eagle accounts, you would need to cut through the muscles of the back, break or cut the ribs free from the spine, and somehow spread them outward while pulling the lungs through the opening. Dr. Luke John Murphy, an expert in Old Norse literature and history at the University of Iceland, has noted several problems with this procedure. First, breaking ribs away from the spine would be extremely difficult to do cleanly. Ribs are relatively tough bones designed to protect vital organs. Breaking them without specialized tools would require tremendous force and would likely result in splintered, jagged breaks rather than clean separations. Second, the immediate physiological response would almost certainly render the victim unconscious or dead very quickly. Once you cut through the back muscles deeply enough to reach the ribs, you would sever numerous blood vessels. The victim would begin bleeding profusely. More critically, breaking the ribs away from the spine would collapse the structural integrity of the chest cavity. The lungs would immediately collapse as air pressure equalized, making breathing impossible. The lungs themselves present another problem. They are delicate organs enclosed in a membrane called the pleura, contained within the chest cavity created by the ribs. They function through negative pressure. When the diaphragm contracts and the ribs expand, it creates a vacuum that draws air into the lungs. Once you break open the chest cavity from the back, this mechanism fails completely. The lungs would collapse like deflated balloons. Could you then pull the lungs out through the back to create wings? Theoretically, perhaps, but they would be collapsed, limp organs, not the majestic spread wings described in later artistic depictions. They certainly wouldn't look like eagle wings. They would look like bloody, deflated sacks of tissue. Perhaps most critically, the victim would almost certainly not remain conscious throughout this procedure. The combination of massive blood loss, shock, pain, and inability to breathe would cause unconsciousness within seconds or minutes at most. The elaborate torture described in popular accounts, where the victim supposedly remains aware and suffering throughout, is medically implausible. Dr. Gareth Williams, a curator at the British Museum and expert on Viking Britain, has suggested that if something like the blood eagle was ever actually performed, it was probably done on already dead bodies. Mutilating corpses as a form of humiliation or desecration was common in medieval warfare. Carving an eagle pattern into a dead enemy's back would have been symbolically meaningful. The eagle feeds on the dead, and the victim is literally given to the eagles, without requiring the impossible feat of keeping someone alive through the procedure. To understand why the blood eagle legend persists, we need to understand Viking Age culture and how violence functioned within it. The Norse were indeed capable of great brutality, but that brutality followed certain cultural logics and rules that the blood eagle, as typically imagined, doesn't quite fit. Viking society was intensely honor-based. Reputation was everything, and insults to honor demanded vengeance. The sagas are filled with stories of feuds that escalated over generations, where men felt compelled to avenge slights to themselves or their kin. In this context, executing an enemy wasn't just about killing them, it was about making a statement, demonstrating your power and satisfying the demands of honor. But Viking violence, even at its most brutal, typically served practical purposes. Execution methods mentioned in reliable historical sources include beheading, hanging, drowning, and being thrown into pits of snakes, as Ragnar Lothbrok was allegedly killed. These methods were cruel but straightforward. They killed the victim without requiring elaborate anatomical knowledge or procedures. The blood eagle, if it existed as described, would have been something different. A ritualized torture execution requiring significant anatomical knowledge, multiple participants, and considerable time to perform. It would have been impractical in most circumstances where executions actually occurred. After battles, during raids, in contested territory where enemies might interrupt. Moreover, while the Vikings were raiders and warriors, they were also sophisticated traders, explorers, and state builders. The popular image of Vikings as mindless savages is a Victorian-era invention. Norse merchants traded across vast distances, from Baghdad to Byzantium. Norse explorers reached North America centuries before Columbus. Norse kings built sophisticated administrative systems. These were complex, cultured people, not cartoon barbarians who spent their time inventing ever more elaborate torture methods. The honor culture also had rules. There were proper and improper ways to fight and kill. Ambushing someone at night was dishonorable. Killing an unarmed man brought shame. Even in the heat of blood feuds, there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. Would a torture execution like the Blood Eagle have been seen as honorable vengeance, or as excessive cruelty that brought shame on the perpetrator? The sagas don't give us clear answers, but the rarity of Blood Eagle references suggests it wasn't a common or accepted practice. We must also consider who wrote down the stories about the Blood Eagle and why. Nearly all our written sources about the Viking Age were composed by Christian authors, often centuries after the events described. These authors had complex relationships with their pagan past. Iceland, where many sagas were written, converted to Christianity around the year 1000 CE. But the conversion was pragmatic and incomplete. Old beliefs and practices persisted alongside Christian ones for generations. When Icelanders in the 13th century wrote about their pagan ancestors, they were trying to understand and preserve their heritage while also positioning themselves as good Christians. This created interesting narrative tensions. On one hand, saga authors often portrayed their pagan ancestors as admirable, brave, honorable, and clever. On the other hand, they sometimes emphasized the darkness and cruelty of pagan times to justify and celebrate the coming of Christianity. The Blood Eagle could serve this latter purpose perfectly, a horrifying practice from the bad old days, proof that Christian civilization had improved things. Snorri Sturluson, who provides the most detailed Blood Eagle description, was a Christian writing for a Christian audience. His Heimskringla was partly a political document, establishing the legitimacy of Norwegian kings and connecting them to ancient lineages. Dramatic stories of pagan-era violence made good reading and served rhetorical purposes, but that doesn't mean Snorri had reliable information about events 3 centuries before his time. Medieval Christian authors across Europe showed a fascination with gruesome execution methods allegedly practiced by pagans, heretics, and infidels. These descriptions often served propaganda purposes, demonstrating the cruelty of others and justifying Christian rule. The Blood Eagle fits this pattern. It's possible that medieval authors took ambiguous poetic references and elaborated them into explicit tortures because such stories served their narrative purposes. For centuries, the Blood Eagle remained an obscure reference in Old Norse texts, of interest primarily to scholars. Then, in the 20th century, it exploded into popular consciousness. How did this happen? The Viking revival of the 19th and early 20th centuries played a role. Romantic nationalism across Scandinavia led to renewed interest in Viking Age culture, but this revival often emphasized Viking nobility, exploration, and democracy, the thing, rather than violence. The Blood Eagle remained a footnote. The real popularization came later, through several channels. Heavy metal music, particularly Scandinavian metal bands, embraced Viking imagery and themes, including the Blood Eagle. Album covers and lyrics referenced the practice, presenting it as evidence of Viking warrior ferocity. This helped spread awareness, particularly among younger audiences drawn to transgressive, extreme content. Historical novels and films picked up the theme. As Vikings became popular subjects for historical fiction, authors looked for dramatic moments and shocking practices to include. The Blood Eagle was perfect, visceral, memorable, and authentically Viking, even if the authenticity was questionable. The television series Vikings, which premiered in 2013, brought the Blood Eagle to a mainstream audience. The show depicted the execution method in graphic detail, presenting it as historical fact rather than disputed legend. Millions of viewers saw these scenes and came away convinced that the Blood Eagle was a real Viking practice. The show's influence on popular perceptions of Viking culture cannot be overstated. Video games followed suit. Titles like Assassin's Creed Valhalla and others featuring Viking themes incorporated the Blood Eagle, further cementing it in popular consciousness. Each new depiction typically presented the practice as unquestionably historical, rarely acknowledging the scholarly debate about whether it ever actually occurred. This modern popularization has created a curious feedback loop. Because the Blood Eagle is now widely known to have been a Viking practice, it gets included in new books, shows and games, which further reinforces public belief in its historicity. Academic arguments about poetic interpretation and medical impossibility can't compete with vivid visual depictions that look and feel authentic. The Blood Eagle legend reveals something important about how we construct and understand history, particularly ancient or medieval history, where sources are limited and often ambiguous. First, there's our hunger for the extreme and sensational. We're drawn to stories of exceptional cruelty or heroism, of practices and events that shock and awe. A poetic reference to someone being killed with sword cuts to the back is historically interesting, but not particularly memorable. An elaborate ritual torture execution is unforgettable. Our brains latch onto the sensational version and resist attempts to complicate or debunk it. Second, there's confirmation bias in how we interpret sources. If we begin with the assumption that Vikings were savage barbarians capable of any cruelty, we read ambiguous poetry as confirming that assumption. We interpret "cut an eagle on his back" literally because it fits our preconceptions. Scholars who question this interpretation are sometimes accused of being overly skeptical or trying to whitewash Viking violence, when they're simply asking whether the evidence supports confident conclusions. Third, there's the challenge of translation and cultural context. Old Norse poetry operated under completely different aesthetic and linguistic rules than modern English. Metaphor, allusion, and indirection were central to the form. Taking such poetry literally is like treating hip-hop lyrics as documentary evidence. You'll misunderstand what's being said unless you grasp the genre's conventions. Fourth, we see how gaps in evidence get filled by imagination. We have no detailed contemporary descriptions of Blood Eagle procedures, no archaeological evidence, no medical tools designed for the purpose. What we have are brief, ambiguous references in texts written centuries after the fact. Yet the popular imagination has filled in all the missing details, creating elaborate scenarios about how the Blood Eagle was performed, who performed it, and why. Finally, the Blood Eagle demonstrates how difficult it is to correct historical misconceptions once they become entrenched in popular culture. Despite decades of scholarly skepticism, despite medical evidence of implausibility, despite the ambiguity of sources, the Blood Eagle persists in public consciousness as an established historical fact. This tells us something sobering about the relationship between academic history and popular understanding. They can diverge dramatically, and the popular version often wins simply through repetition and emotional resonance. So, what's the truth about the Blood Eagle? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain, but it probably wasn't what we think it was. The most likely scenario, based on current scholarly consensus, is that cutting an eagle on someone's back was originally a poetic way of describing a particular type of fatal sword wound, cuts to the back that killed someone and left their corpse for the eagles and ravens. Over time, as the original poetic context was lost, later medieval authors interpreted these phrases literally and elaborated them into explicit anatomical procedures that may never have actually occurred. It's possible that some kind of symbolic mutilation of corpses occurred, where patterns were carved into dead enemies' backs as a form of desecration and message sending. This would be culturally consistent with medieval warfare practices and wouldn't require the medical impossibility of keeping someone alive through the procedure. What we can say with confidence is that the Blood Eagle, as depicted in modern entertainment, an elaborate torture execution performed on living, conscious victims who remain aware throughout, is almost certainly ahistorical. It's medically implausible, poorly evidenced in sources, and inconsistent with what we know about Viking Age culture and practices. Does this mean Vikings weren't violent? Of course not. They were raiders and warriors who lived in a brutal age. They killed, they plundered, they sometimes executed enemies in cruel ways. But they were also humans like us. Complex, culturally sophisticated people whose violence, while real, followed its own logics and limits. The Blood Eagle legend tells us less about what Vikings actually did, and more about what later ages imagined them doing. It reveals our fascination with the grotesque, our tendency to exoticize and demonize the past, and our difficulty in thinking critically about claims that confirm our preconceptions. The next time you see the Blood Eagle depicted in a show or game, remember, you're probably watching a legend born from misunderstood poetry, elaborated by medieval Christians centuries after the fact, and popularized by modern entertainment looking for shocking content. It's a powerful myth, and myths tell us important things about the cultures that create and perpetuate them. But that doesn't make them history.